I do have my compañera Erika Alexia Ledesma. So stand up, Erika. She's one of our young Chicana activists who is, there's a nice little cadre of young people that are with Unite Oregon and different organizations. She's with the Racial Equity Coalition, helps sometimes with Unite Oregon, is all over the map. And so I'm really honored that she's actually here with me today to lend a little bit of support for this presentation. The way that this presentation is going to function is that whenever she feels like she wants to add something into the presentation, then she's just going to pop up and add some information. So I don't purport today to actually come in with a type of game plan, you know, and be like, here's the strategy, right? Because as you notice, there are probably like only a few of us that are Latinx in the room, right? And so the Latino population really has to be part of that conversation in terms of like what a strategy might look like. But what I'm thinking about this morning is that sometimes I was really encouraged by the little bit of the presentation that I heard in the previous, the previous presentation about language and about understanding where other people are coming from and their cultural viewpoints. And I think that today what I can share with you are some of the nuances and intricacies in the Latino community that might pose sort of obstacles if they're framed in the wrong way in terms of organizing. So without further ado, the first thing that I want to mention is that Latinos or Latinx people are not a monolithic group, right? And so I wanted to show you this picture because I was thinking about, for those of you that are in the Rogue Valley or from the Rogue Valley, you might have remembered that this summer we had a couple of incidents, racialized incidents with people that are Black in this community. They were really pretty horrible incidents, and in both cases, the women that were targeted were told something to the effect about being killed, right? And so one of the women, though, the way that the second incident played out is that the woman was identified as Black or African American, but she is, in fact, part of the Latino community. And so it's and the person was Mika Cole. She doesn't, hide her identity. But I mentioned that because we come in all colors. There are some people that are Latino, that look a lot like this young guy here who passed, right? And who are white in terms of their racial identity. And then there are people that sort of look, kind of like, me or Erika. But we also have a number of people that are, Afro-Latino or also Asian Latino. So I just wanted to kind of like put that out there, that we are racially not the same group, and also politically, you also will find some differences. So, as a matter of fact, and Jessica told me that we'll be sharing the PowerPoints with you all, so you'll be able to get this. But this is from the Pew Research Center, and the one thing that I wanted to show you is that if we look at, for example, the breakdown of Cubans and their voting patterns in the United States, some of you are probably really familiar with the Cuban voting patterns. That Cubans generally tend to vote on the Republican side of things. That Cubans tend to be, and there's a whole history as to why that happens, right? Many of the people that came to the United States in terms of exile from Cuba were people that were fairly privileged, advantaged people, right, that were fleeing the Castro regime. So anything that smacks of the left is something that they are very suspicious of. Now, this isn't to say that all Cubans are like that. I actually have married an uncle who is Cuban and seems to be fairly on the left, right? But, I just wanted to point out that, there are some differences among some of the communities. Here in Oregon, we are finding that more of the people, we don't have a huge Latino Cuban population. Most of the people are, going to be from Mexico, and then we have some Central American folks as well. But I just wanted to show you this little graphic so that you could see that even within Latinos, there's a variety, and particularly according to geographic areas.
When you speak of Latino, what exactly are you talking about?
Yes, that's a really great question. So I am talking about generally people that are coming from the Americas and the Caribbean. So if you were colonized by the Spaniards, and colonized by the Portuguese, as in the case of Brazil, then generally speaking, you're going to be part of that Latino community. Why? Because we share some very similar kinds of between Spaniards and Portuguese colonization. We share some very similar shared cultural traits. Like, for example, in the case of religion, for example, that we were missionized, most of us, right, into Catholicism, and so that gives us sort of like a particular viewpoint. A lot of us were indigenous peoples that, mixed with some of these European groups, and we have a particular viewpoint that is unique to us. We would not necessarily, under the Latino category, include Spaniards, right, because they don't have that particular colonization history, or they have it but on the other side, right, as the colonizers, right?
Yeah, I lived in New Mexico for a period of time,
yes.
And they identify differently.
Hispanos, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, or manitos, or,
But they're more Hispanic,
yes.
Even though they, of course, came and colonized.
Yes.
The people that came and started New Mexico.
Yes.
Identify differently.
So I'm just going to say this is going to be the little sort of jab at New Mexicans, because unless there's a Hispano New Mexican in the room, but even if you were here, I'm not going to care. So the thing that I might say about New Mexicans is and I would say the same thing about some of the Californio families. So you've heard of people that identify as Californios. And then some of those old Texan families, right? These were individuals that their families historically received Spanish land grants, right? And so, again, they're coming kind of a little bit from a different sort of perspective. They were sort of landed gentry that received these land grants, and then when we had the Mexican-American War, or the U.S.-Mexico War, those individuals didn't cross the border crossed them, right? And so they have a kind of unique experience as well. I do want to say that I get a little bit tired of hearing about New Mexicans always claiming their Spanish heritage, because they had to have had sex with other people that were, the men, they were mostly men that originally came, right? And I'm like, who do they procreate with? There's a little bit of sort of denying of identity, but that's their prerogative, right? So moving on, right? I do want to actually also point this out. Because I had a friend who called me after the election and was really angry and was like, about 30% of Latino people voted for Trump, right? And I actually know this really well. Why? Because my father was one of those people, right? And I was like, why? How could you do this? You came to this country as an undocumented person, right? And that was a whole conversation. Thanksgiving was very interesting. I suspect some of you also had very interesting Thanksgivings, right? So the thing that I want to say is I want to talk a little bit about why some of the people might have aligned with the Trump side. And so what I'm going to tell you this morning might help you sort of think about it. And I'm not saying this as a defense for the people who voted for Trump. But I also wanted to point out perhaps some of the cultural differences that people are not understanding about the Latino communities that might then make sense to you. So I want to point that out. Now, when my friend called me and she was like, did you know? I also said, well, I also know that X amount percentage of women also voted for Trump, right? So there you go. What do we do about it? We have some work to do, right? All right. So the thing that I want to talk about is familialism. Who's heard of this term, familialism? So if, generally speaking, this is like a generalization, right? And Erika, you can jump in if you want to say, no, this is not true, or to say, actually, this is true. For a lot of us that are Latinos, the point of understanding or the reason why we do things, it's because of our family. We are super connected, generally speaking, to our families. And as an example, it happens less among younger generations, like in the case of Erika, but it is not uncommon for, let's say, Mexican families to have their children live with them until they marry, right? And in fact, would you agree that that's true, right? And so it's almost like a cultural expectation that if you are unmarried, whether you are male or female, that you would be living with your family, right? And then as a consequence, we have familial obligations. So I have a son who's getting ready to move to Chicago, he says, right, in September. And I have a lot of family in Chicago. And as he's going to pursue his college education, there's an expectation that I have and that my family has as a trade-off, that they're there to be his sort of security net, but then he has a kind of familial obligation to make connections with this group of people in Chicago. And so we're very still family oriented. My family can't understand why I live in Oregon by myself with other family members. They're like, why? How can you live without us, right? My family actually either lives in groups in Chicago, in groups in Los Angeles, or in groups in the San Joaquin Valley in the same town, right? So we are still sort of kind of connected. Would you agree that that's the case? So because we're always thinking about family, and it's not uncommon sometimes when I'm teaching, if I have a Chicana or Chicanic student in my classroom, I see this less, but it wasn't uncommon for me to have a student in the classroom who maybe has a familial obligation, is sitting in my college class, I teach English, and gets a call from a parent and says, hey, you have to come here because we need you. The family needs you. You know, something happened, you need to take care of your little brother or whatever, for that student to actually leave my classroom and take care of family business. So I'm telling you this because then when, say like the Republican Party talks about family values, you see what I'm saying? This sort of resonates with Latinos, but I have to tell you that they're like, oh yes, we're into la familia, right? But I have to say that the Republican family values are not really necessarily the same as our family values, because I think that we still operate in a kind of clannish kind of manner, right? And we would still expect, for example, our 20-year-olds, our 24-year-olds to, in some sense or way, have some kind of connection with us, and that, you know, like if I were 20 and about to make a big decision, that
take into account our family of the decisions that we make.
Yeah.
It's going to impact overall our family.
Say it loud and stand up.
I said we have to take into consideration our family and how the decisions we make will impact them.
Yeah. So you see how, like, then this idea of family values, when they hear, you know, when Latinos are hearing this, they're like, oh wow, this must be the party for us, because we are about familialism. But I can guarantee you that it's not in the same way that the Republican Party is thinking about it. We're really thinking about it in a very kind of clannish sort of way. Also, because of our colonization, you know, a lot of people still are at least nominally Catholic, right? And they hold on to some of the values of Catholicism. Or people are leaving the Catholic Church and becoming evangelicals. Okay, so that's the other thing, right? And so the anti-abortion stance is really big. I don't want to put pro-life because language is important, and to me pro-life really means like, if you care about this kid that's in the womb, el vientre or whatever, you better care about that person until that person dies, right? You know, and that to me is pro-life. But the anti-abortion positions become really big in the Latino community. And so sometimes people are like, wow, the abortion issue. So this is why, for example, if you look at Latinos, come to a Spanish mass, right? And you will see that, you know, our community members are still having 4 kids, 5 kids, 6 kids, you know. I think now more common is 4, like 4, 3 or 4, right? But we are definitely having more children than, our Anglo-American Catholic counterparts. You know, and so the anti-abortion issue becomes another kind of motivator. So you can begin to see like why the Republican Party in its sort of core values, in quotations, thank you, could seem to resonate for people particularly as they are becoming involved in the political process. Does that make sense? So, now, here's a really interesting piece, though. So this has happened in Mexico City, but it also was happening in the United States. There was a Familia es Familia campaign. What do we do with our LGBTQ children? Right? Now, sometimes parents actually do kick their children out and are like, this is a sin and blah, blah, blah. This has happened actually in our own community with some of our community members. But as the parents begin to assimilate this idea of, wait a minute, what did I just do to my kid? And it's not like an overnight thing, right? But as they begin to really sort of like go, wait a minute, but if I'm really about family, how could I have done that to my children, right? And in this Familia es Familia campaign, which was a sort of media campaign that happened in the United States with some very famous media personalities, Latinos began to rethink the LGBTQ question. And so, like, I know that in my own particular family, you know how people say like 1 in 10 people are queer, that's like a statistic that people throw out. Well, in my family it's 1 in 7, right? We have a lot of queer people in my family, and I think that's great. But I know that in my family, because of some of our sort of ways of thinking about things, and because of Catholicism and religion, and machismo, and a lot of these other kinds of concepts, that initially when my cousins were coming out, the family was a little bit like, what do we do with these individuals? And there was some isolation of those individuals initially, and then eventually my family came around to the Familia es Familia, and now actually some of the people who I think were most homophobic in the initial coming out process of our family members, I think are some of our best advocates. So like my mother is like a big LGBTQ advocate because she's like, they're our kids, right? And not to mention that, by the way, the Catholic Church came out with, the Catholic bishops came up with an interesting letter, Always Our Children, that also brought in the LGBTQ community. So the family issue is significant and important. This is why, by the way, so if we're all about family, 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 this is where the Republican Party, except for John McCain before he joined Sarah Palin, so you'll notice in the previous slide, John McCain has been the candidate who has received more votes from the Latino community. Mm-hmm. And that was because at some point John McCain actually had worked on immigration issues. And again, for Latinos, that's like, wow, that's inclusive of some of our family members who might be undocumented, right? And not all Latinos have undocumented family members, but a lot of us actually do, right? And so the way that we're reading immigration is another family issue. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's
and,
a really good point.
Yeah, so this is where Donald Trump, well, he lost people along the way for many, many, many reasons, right? Mm-hmm. But his anti-immigration stance was something that was like, wow, you are against our families. No way. This is not going to happen, right? And so for a lot of people, this was the deal breaker, right? When we think about working class issues and the economy, again, it's taken from a familial viewpoint, right? How can we, so if you're going to be talking about working class issues, don't talk about it in terms of the individual progressing. It's like, what can happen for that family to be able to reach some kind of security? Does that make sense? All right. Are there any questions about this? There are a lot of really interesting articles that look at familialism. If you wanted, the Hannon Library, if you have access to that at SOU. I know there are a lot of Ben folks here. There are a lot of academic articles that have talked about this concept of familialism. Some people see it as a really negative kind of sort of concept, because as it stacks up to individualism in the United States, it seems almost anathema to that. But I think those of us that are coming from familialism actually find some source of power and strength in it. So, all right. Yes. Oh, sorry.
That's all right. I rose my hand when you turned away. So I'm going to get organized. I'm Nancy B. Brandon out of Bend, Oregon. And I was just wondering, does the familialism, does comunidad also resonate, like community and familialism? So if we have messaging around community, does that translate?
Yes.
Or is it very distinct, those two?
What do you think, Erika y Parate?
I feel like they kind of go hand in hand. I think family is more like a clan, but community can be like more broad. So I don't know if it would translate. Well, do you see it?
I think that there's a way of making it similar, because again, if you think about the way, so I'm thinking about the Rogue Valley and some of the families that have settled here as migrants and have been here for maybe, like 20, 30 years. And it's not like one person, but various sort of like brothers and sisters, and then the sister-in-law of this person and so forth. So I think that comunidad actually could work well, because or you could say familia y comunidad, if you wanted to really sort of capture all of it. But I think when we think of la comunidad, we are thinking about like the cousins, the aunts, the second cousins, which to us matter, right? Actually, when we even say cousins, we don't even distinguish between my first cousin, my second cousin. We just say mi prima, mi tía, mi tío, and that kind of thing. So comunidad is a great word. Yeah. So I would encourage you to use it. All right. So I just wanted to show you a little bit about the latest Latino voting patterns in the 2016 election. What was really kind of exciting is that we had 4 million more people from 4 years prior that were eligible to vote. The only thing that I'm kind of noticing, though, between the various different kinds of election cycles in terms of Latino voting is that while we were increasing in terms of numbers of voting, we didn't really like jump up in terms of percentage of Latino voters, right? And that causes me a little bit of a source of like, what is happening? Why didn't we have, we had a lot of people that were super angry about the messaging around Latinos in this last election. Yet, I bet if once we get the information, and I understand that later in 2017 we'll get more information about the breakdown of who all the voters were and how many people actually didn't vote, right? Yeah. And I suspect that we're going to have a good number of individuals who decided actually at the end of the day to not vote. Yeah. So I just wanted to present that to you. So out of Latinos, 11% of the voters happen to be Latino. But we as a population are moving into, particularly in that 18-year-old category, we're hitting almost that 20% mark of 18-year-olds, right? And so it's kind of like, why don't we have comparable numbers, right? So I wanted to talk about some of the obstacles that I see in Latino engagement. And I'm sorry if if you can't see this, I promise I will give this to Jessica, and then you'll be able to read it in a better way. I realize that maybe my red no vote is not letting us see all of the letters. Of course, one big issue in the Latino community is lack of citizenship, right? We have people that are, some people that are undocumented. We also have people that are what we call LPRs, legal permanent residents. If you are a resident, you are not allowed to vote. Donald Trump says that there were a lot of people that were undocumented and LPRs that were voting. That's, very difficult to do. And I just have to say, if you are a person who is an LPR or an undocumented person who takes, who votes, and you are discovered, you actually trigger a lifetime ban. There's so if you have a false claim to citizenship, and you are not a citizen, you trigger a lifetime ban from ever being able to be here legally in the United States. Does that make sense? So when Donald Trump says, like, I know that all of these people were voting, most people in the Latino community know about the lifetime ban and are not about to endanger because they're waiting for some kind of program that maybe could adjust their status if they are undocumented. Or if they're legal permanent residents, they would never put their residency in jeopardy to engage in fraudulent voting because they know that the stakes are particularly high. There is no waiver, my husband's an immigration attorney, there is no waiver that could save you from a false claim to citizenship, okay? That is even the case, so my husband, the only exceptions to this would be if you happen to be, so we know of a family in the Valley where the parents had not told the children that the children that they were undocumented. The children actually believed that they had been born in the United States. And so the children had made false claims to citizenship on, like college applications and things like that, until the parents then told them. And in those particular cases, there might be some kind of waiver thing, but if you're over 16 years old and you made that sort of false claim, it's a really, really difficult journey to get a waiver for that. We also know of another family who, this is a really sad story, convinced, they had two daughters, one of them passed away. They used the citizenship of the dead daughter to give to the undocumented daughter and raised that daughter with a false identity. So that girl, they changed her name, but she was really young, so she actually didn't know, right? Until she became an adult, right? And when it happens to you as a child where there's a false claim because your parents pushed you into a false claim, there may be penalties for the parents, but there wouldn't necessarily be a penalty for a child, right? So I just wanted to tell you the lack of citizenship, of course, is an obstacle in our community to voting. The lack of intrinsic motivation. I want to pair that with the feeling by young people that voting does not matter. So in this particular election, a lot of Latinos were very, very big Bernie fans. I suspect that there are a lot of people in this room that might have been Bernie fans. I was one too, right? And so a lot of young people were feeling like Bernie spoke to them, Bernie included them, that they were part of, And then when Bernie didn't become the candidate, they didn't feel like Hillary Clinton's messaging resonated with them. And this idea of a kind of intrinsic motivation, like what does she have to offer us? What is, and I know that probably some of you might have felt the same way, right? Like what, you know, and a lot of the young people were like, she's a sellout just like, you know, everybody else. And so, I suspect that when we find out why people didn't vote, if we actually go in and do some, you know, quantitative research, we're gonna find, you know, that, or qualitative research, we're gonna find that a lot of the young people who were really on fire, because I saw this on our campus, they were wearing Bernie sweatshirts, had Bernie pins, and the moment that he stopped being a candidate, they couldn't seem to connect to something that Hillary was saying that included the Latino community, right? And so the lack of intrinsic motivation, you know, and the feeling by a lot of young people, a lot of Latinos that I helped register for this election, so I like registering people in my church and wherever I can, at school or whatever. A lot of the young people don't feel like the Republican or the Democratic Party speak to them at all. Would you say that that's correct? And then do you want to stand up and...
Well, I was talking to a lot of my like friends, colleagues, and a lot of them weren't registering to vote, and I was trying to get them to register to vote. And I was like, why do you think voting doesn't have an impact? And for many, it doesn't like translate to, well, not like direct action, but they just don't see it as something that can cause change, like voting. You know, they're more like you have to do something within your community more at a local level. And a lot of them were just like disenchanted with like, they keep voting and nothing happens, like everything stays the same. So I feel like people just have lost motivation in like voting overall.
And I'll give you an example with Oregon. So in Oregon, we have the driver's license issue, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I love some of our Oregon legislatures. One of them opened up this morning, this conference, right? I love Peter Buckley, you know, and we're friends. I do remember that my husband was doing sort of like a little bit of a circuit, kind of, you know, going around to different places talking about the importance of driver's licenses and retaining that as something for the people in the Latino community. And different folks in the Democratic Party said, we are being told by the party to not even bring up immigration issues up because it's a losing proposition.
Really?
Guess what that means? You've just lost a lot of Latino people that might have voted on the Democratic, you know, for the Democratic Party, right? And for us in our community to see that, so I am not against weed, you know, bring it on, right? But for us to see sort of like marijuana, yes, driver's licenses, no.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Like it was like, wow, you don't care about our, like transporting our kids, about taking a, you know, about safety, even your own personal safety. And I'm not saying you folks particularly, but this is the way that it translated into the Latino community, right? The Democratic Party doesn't care about us. They didn't even have, can I say balls? They didn't even have the balls, right? You know, they didn't even have the balls to even bring up the immigration conversation. In fact, it was more like, don't bring it up, let's bring up the economy. Well, for us, driver's licenses are totally connected to the economy.
Yes,
how are we going to get our kids to places, right? So this is, so I have to say that in the state of Oregon, after the driver's license thing, this is huge.
Yeah.
This is huge. Our community was really hurt by that, right? And if you think about then familialism, you know, then wow, maybe this party would care, except that, of course, a lot of people had super anti-immigration stances. We'll go here and then here. And can you stand up and identify?
Yes. I'm Tim from the Dalles. We have a very large Latino population in, is it the correct word to say now, Latinx, so it's not gender specific?
Yes.
Okay.
So I still sometimes, because I'm old, I say
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
So we had a conversation, there was some women who came from, Hispanic women who came from the Dalles. There were some women who came from the Dalles and said the very same thing, specifically about the driver's license. Have the sheriff give us our license back. And now my question is, who has the authority to do that? Was that a legislative decision? Was it individual counties? How did that work?
We voted as a state.
We did.
Yeah.
We did.
Okay.
We voted as a state. So are you answering that man's question?
Yeah, the
Okay.
legislature passed a
Can you-
bill. Yeah, hi.
Sorry. And then I'll go to the lady here.
Yeah, I'm Ron Morgan. I'm from the Democratic Party of Oregon. So the Democratic legislature in the House and Senate passed a bill to legalize driver's licenses for legal residents who are not citizens. So, and it was not tied to citizenship, and it would basically just be a driver's license. It was not an official ID. People couldn't use it to vote. And as soon as they did, the Republicans turned around and put it on the ballot. So that was the timeline.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it is a state issue.
And that was defeated
What year was
last,
that?
what year did
It
that?
was in 2012.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So, you
is-
know, so that's why when we're talking about, so now imagining the Bernie kids, and then on top of that, and I say Bernie kids because, you know, I mean, I guess I was one of them as well, right? But, you know, but an older Bernie kid, right? You know, there were decisions made that adversely affected our community, you know, and that put our people at risk, right? The lady over here, and stand up, please.
My name is Josefina for Redmond, Oregon.
I want to add the obstacles or the motivation for the Latinos don't vote is the history we have in our countries. Because
Yes, thank you.
we go to vote
Yes.
and the vote don't make any effect.
Yes.
I am from Venezuela and we have now a very big crisis and they want to change the constitution the way the people, they think in their vote, but they don't vote it.
Yes.
And it's difficult for people like us and in other countries to say, okay, the vote is important.
Yes.
When we have the driver license campaign, we can work with that, with the Latino, because, okay, don't vote for the president, don't vote for the senator, but vote for this, because that's something they're going to affect it, no?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, that's part of the no motivation.
Yes, thank you. So not only low motivation, but lack of familiarity with this political process. So I'm Mexican American or Chicanx, you know, and I know that my family in Mexico is like, ¿para qué votamos? Like, why should we vote, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, they'll always talk about the PRI or whatever political party is in power going off, buying people's votes or stuffing the ballots, right? So that's another kind of obstacle, and I'm glad that you named it, that sometimes we have in the Latinx community is if our families come from those particular histories of disenfranchisement, then there's like, well, what's the point of voting, right? And so that there is that. Now I have to say though that in the 1990s, Jorge Castañeda wrote a book called The Mexican Shock, and it was about Mexicans that had become engaged and found out something about the political process in the United States and found power in it, and then guess what? Took it to their small towns and changed up the political landscape in the small towns in Mexico because they were influenced by some aspects of the US political system and, you know, and began taking it back home. And some of those folks actually, because they retained Mexican citizenship, were running for, you know, positions in Mexico. So it was really interesting. But the lack of familiarity with the political process is big. This is why, for example, it's difficult for us in our community to think, let me write a letter, right? Yeah. Would you say that, like, you know?
Yeah, because I think a big barrier is if you're first generation and your parents don't know the political process, they can't teach you how to vote or how to engage in like these political processes. But so our parents don't know that, and we have to teach ourselves. So, and it's overall it's kind of hard, and they teach us in what elementary, middle school, but you forget it. So sometimes I feel like I don't have a great understanding of like Congress, what every branch does, you know, because it's not like, not say cultural, but because our parents lack that information, so they can't teach us where if parents that have grown up here, maybe third, fourth, fifth generation, then they do have more of understanding and can teach their kids.
Yeah, so that's,
Role models.
yeah, that's where we're overwhelmed by the political process. So in the last couple of years, any chance I have at my church to do a voter registration run, I do it. And then as we were getting close to the election, I was telling people, hey, have you voted? What have you done? And people were like, I'm really overwhelmed. You get that voter pamphlet and you're like, what do I do with this, right? And so the idea of writing letters, the idea of calling our congressmen is really foreign, right? So that's another part of that. I'm gonna kind of make sure that we move on, because I do see that despite all of this, we actually have a lot of opportunities for Latino engagement. I want to make sure that there's an understanding that even though Latinos might have been disenfranchised in their own political processes back in their countries of origin, or even in the political processes here in the United States, because of our familialism, and a lot of us are brought up to think about service. We even have a word like if I have a particular need, or I'm ill and Erika decides to bring, something to me, to help me have food or whatever, she's being very servicial, very sort of service oriented. And that's actually a valuable quality in our community. And what that makes or leads to is, there was a really interesting book, and I want to get the information correctly. In 1997, Will Flores and Rena Benmayer, they were two scholars from California. They were part of a group called the Latino Cultural Studies Working Group. They were working with Renato Rosaldo, who is from Stanford. Some of you might know who he is, who does a lot of things around citizenship and imagined communities. Began looking at this idea of Latino cultural citizenship. They noticed that even people who were undocumented or were legal permanent residents and didn't have the ability to participate fully in the citizenship process of voting were in their daily lives or activities trying to stake out a place of identity, a space of safety for their Latino selves, right? And so what Latino cultural citizenship is any time that it's the range of activities, daily activities, where Latinos claim space in society. They define their communities, they define who they are. It allows them for a space of safety and membership. And so in those particular instances, what that might mean is parents going to parent meetings. Parents going to advocate. I've noticed this in a couple of the local school districts. We have a lot of racism in our schools, right? And parents are showing up to advocate for their children and demand something different. That's part of that Latino cultural citizenship. Some of those parents are undocumented, yet they're still going to try to create a space of safety for their children. Now, one of the things that Will Flores and Rena Benmayer point out is that a lot of times the dominant culture has looked at Latino cultural citizenship as Latinos attempting to separate themselves out through difference, as opposed to sort of just creating a space of safety for themselves. So as I look around the room here today and see that a lot of people here are I'm going to make an assumption, are probably not Latino or Latinx, right? It's yeah, it was like, I think she might be, right? Yeah.
It's a chance.
Our Latinx are not Latinx. Our own perceptions of what the Latino community might be doing. So sometimes, I've noticed this with schools. Why are the Latinos all sitting by themselves separately? Why are they not hanging out with the other kids? See, they separate themselves, right? They don't want to be part of us. And instead we might have to shift our way of thinking to go, isn't that people are trying, that are generally hearing rhetoric of exclusion, creating spaces where they can feel safe, that don't mean that people can't come into them if they are perceived to be safe people, right? So Latinos are engaging in a type of cultural citizenship that isn't the voting type of or calling kind of citizenship, but is part of advocacy. They're doing it in healthcare, they're doing it on the education front, they're doing it in terms of labor, you know, as workers. But please, folks, as we are organizing, let's not mistake Latino cultural citizenship as a group of people that are trying to be separatists and create difference. That understanding that it's really creating a sense of belonging, which is what we all are trying to do, right? And if we shift our mentality about that, we could actually create really great, I think, bridges through that Latino cultural citizenship. All right, moving on. There are some suggestions that people have made, and I think they're awesome suggestions. Every once in a while, I like talking to Mayor Stromberg here in Ashland, and he's always like really big on, why don't we get those Briscoe kids, these little tiny kids in Briscoe, to come to City Hall so that I can begin explaining to them at a really young age what it is that I do, what happens in this building called City Hall. And so, Sarah, if you're taking notes on this, right, maybe it's not with the mayor, but maybe it's in some kind of, right? But, you know, and I know that you have a candidate school, right? It's having these academies on political positions so that, as Erika was saying, we can know, like, what we have Oregon senators as well as, like, senators that are part of the Senate. How does that work, right? Explaining the processes and those positions are really key. Here locally, the sheriff had a Latino academy because he wanted to explain, so the previous Sheriff Corey Falls, wanted to be able to explain the law enforcement process. We were having a lot of problems with law enforcement, and I think in some ways maybe still continue to have some, right, with the Latino community. And so Sheriff Falls was like, I'm going to bring people on board so that they can know what it is that we do and so that we can find out the concerns of the Latino community. Those kinds of academies, if they were available, would really, I think, spark up people, and some of those obstacles that I pointed out before about being overwhelmed with the political process or being unfamiliar with it would be taken care of, right? The power of collectivism. So I don't know if you can share how you voted, not like who you voted for, but how you engaged in the political process of voting this particular season. I think te juntaste?
Yeah,
So,
a group of our friends, like, we all got together and we read the pamphlet and then we just cast our vote. But it was like talking, having conversations on like the different people and like their agendas and making sure that we were all clear on like if anyone had like a question and whoever had more information, then we would like share. So it was like a dialogue.
What was your source? I mean, what were your sources for finding out what the positions are for candidates?
Community, like different organizations had put out different sources. And then just like ourselves and like doing more reading. But it's always tough.
Yeah, one of the sources that I disseminated to churches, the Catholic Church, since I'm Catholic and practicing, I disseminated the Rural Organizing Project's stand on the
Publication.
on the different measures, and the way that I sort of told the community about it was, you know, this isn't to tell you how to vote per se. This is a group that I think is interested in forwarding democracy, and wanting to see, you know, what measures take away democracy. And you might have a different position on it, but at least it gives you some kind of baseline. And if the baseline is democracy, which I think is a great baseline, right? It's a good starting point, you know. But I know that at our church, we are talking about having, you know, sessions where we don't tell people how to vote. So you never want to be in the position necessarily of telling people exactly how to vote, especially in the church, you could get in trouble, right? But being able to have some kind of like way I think for Latinos, it works really well to actually have it as a kind of community vote. So what I'm proposing, I know of people who had house sessions, so like you kind of had a house session. I had one. My godson was a first-time voter, and I was like, come on along, right? And we had dinner and then, jumped into the voting. And I think it was really interesting because after we discussed some of the issues, he's like, I don't think I'm gonna vote this way. And I'm like, that's your prerogative, right? You're free to vote, but you're voting, and so community centers, a lot of people who live in apartments or trailer parks, or like Anderson Vista is a local place where there are a lot of migrant farm worker folks with children that are US citizens and that are adults and are living with them. They have a community center. We could have a community center vote night or a series of vote nights where people could come together and, understand the complexity of that pamphlet, right? I did a house session with a family that had 6 voters. You probably know Los Ramirez, those boys. And I was like, they were like, I don't know, they didn't want to engage in the presidential election. They were Bernie fans, and they were like, we're not voting for president. I'm like, I can't tell you what to do, but there are a lot of other really important measures happening. And so we sat down and we worked through the pamphlet, and then they cast their votes. This also might happen. I have to say that sometimes I actually go through my neighborhood and round up the vote, and I have like the grades, like who voted or who hasn't historically voted. I love it. No, have you ever done that before? They'll give you if you don't vote a lot, then you're like in the C or D or F category, right? And we never waste our time on the A and B voters because we know they're gonna vote, generally speaking, right? So when you do like canvassing, I actually go with stamps because sometimes people are like,
Actually can't.
you actually can't do that? I do. I show up and sometimes people will say like, oh, I always vote, but I never have a stamp. Here's a stamp, right?
Or you can drop it on our black ballots, and you can drop them off in the ballot box.
Yeah. So, so those are the things. Don't tell people then that I've been doing things that are not right. Sometimes connections to movements of collectivism. So sometimes like in the Latino community, calling back some of our previous heroes like Dolores Huerta or Cesar Chavez, or some of the local people here that have made some really great strides. Many years ago, we lost someone, Don Claudino, who's really big in the Latino community. And I know that for folks who knew him, sort of referring back to him as a kind of like, hey, Don Claudino would have loved this, right? He worked hard for you, are really great strategies in bringing the community on board. Again, because we are really a collective people, right? And then for those people that are kind of younger, so this would not ever be like my category, but there's a thing called Voto Latino, and what it is it's a media platform where if you sign up to be part of this platform, they will send you like text messages or little media messages with famous stars that are reminding you to vote, right? And that might help millennials. It wouldn't really necessarily help someone like me, right? All right, opportunities. Sometimes people, when they are addressing our community, and please understand that by saying this, I am not wanting you to think that our community is stupid. I don't want you to think that it's okay then to be paternalistic to the Latino community or to infantilize the Latino community. If you were speaking to Latinos that are professionals, by all means use academic and legal jargon if you want to. They probably would be perfectly fine with that. But the reality of a lot of our people here in Oregon is that they are coming from a migrant farm worker background, right, or a working class background, and that some of our folks, have 3rd grade educations, 6th grade educations, etc. And then people come in and they're using really super academic language or super jargony legal language, okay? So don't, right? And you're probably, if you're organizers and you're dealing with, the disenfranchised white population, you probably have learned that lesson, right? It's a really great alienator. But it is a really good opportunity to sort of remember that and then shift the language. For us, making things really concrete, I have our friend Sal Esquivel up on the page, right? Feel free to hiss if you want, right? You know, but you know, things that really affect the Latino community, like the driver's license issue or the English-only issue, which is something that is in the works to be proposed in the state of Oregon, right? That there are some people who are interested in moving us into an English-only state, okay? What would that mean for the Latino community? It doesn't only mean government documents. It means that if say like your local clinic that helps Latinos gets federal funding, they might then therefore be mandated to not be able to print things in Spanish, right? Same thing with the schools, right? If you're receiving federal dollars, it is conceivable, right, that that materials don't go out to parents in the appropriate language. By the way, we already have districts in Josephine County that refuse to do Spanish language pieces for parents, right? And it's not even the law. So things that are sort of appeal. So you know, you might want to be thinking about like, well, how does this affect Latinos and how does it connect to familialism as a way of organizing to speak specifically to that particular population? Use of humor, right? After the election, I think it's safe to say that a lot of the Latinos in Oregon felt disenfranchised and felt well, probably like a lot of you, really fucking depressed, right? There's no other way of saying it, right? Except that, you know, we had kind of the extra added perk. I do remember the day after the election. I live in Ashland. Going to one of my favorite greasy spoons on the other side of town, owned by the way, a Mexican man, and sitting there with my son, and having a man who was also there enjoying what looked like, you know, a nice juicy burger, looking at us really in a very hostile manner. After the election, people in the Latino community did have people come up to them and say, when are you leaving? I thought we won, I thought we were getting rid of you, and that kind of stuff. Our kids in schools are still hearing that, by the way. So one of the things that happened, so my husband, as I said, is an immigration attorney that does family law. And one of the ways that he addresses the Latino community under this duress and pressure is through humor. And you've seen him kind of, he's like a ham, like me, right? And so he uses humor a lot. And I know that some people who had come into a presentation that he did for the Latino community felt that my husband might have been inappropriate. They couldn't understand the use of humor because they're like, wow, this is a really serious topic. Like, why is this guy being like super, you know, like funny about something that is very serious? Our community knows the gravity of the seriousness, and I think that actually humor is a really kind of like good way of easing the tensions to actually allow people to sort of connect, right? So don't discount the use of humor as a kind of opportunity in organizing. And finally, I want to say, there are a lot of opportunities probably in your towns where organizing and connecting with the Latino community is happening. There are a lot of Know Your Rights workshops that are going on throughout the state, being put on by local nonprofit organizations, being put on by clinics, being put on. And so what I would say is if you really are interested in building a connection with the Latino community, then your participation, being able to, for people to see your face and identify you and go, hey, I've seen her at several of these sessions, so I think that she's like with us, is sort of that bridge building and construction of, of a coalition. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree, because I think a lot of times we're thinking about engaging the Latino community. It's like we want them to engage with us, but it's like, why not you engage with them? You know, meet them where they're at. you know, in their spaces, because a lot of times they're not gonna be in certain events because they might not hear about them or they might not be accessible. So it's like finding out the places that they are spending time at and then going there and building relationships, building that trust, because I think in order to organize people around issues, you need to build that sense of community and solidarity with them in order to get action.
Yeah. So this reminds me of something with the North Dakota pipeline. You know, the government, if you recall, had meetings with, or attempted to have meetings with Native peoples in spaces that historically have been hostile to Native American people, right? And they also try to do it through ways that were not, you know, properly sort of speaking culturally to indigenous peoples, right? Like, for example, if I were trying to have something for Native peoples, I would never have something at a school, right? Because of all the trauma that boarding schools and the school process has for people. And so what was really interesting in the no DAPL sort of conversation was that the government was saying, well, we sent messages about these meetings that we were having, right? First of all, question mark. Second of all, if you really wanted the input of the people, why didn't you actually go to the people in their appropriate spaces, right? And that's, I think, what I'm saying about the Latino community as a way of, I think until we actually create that coalition, so this doesn't have to be a forever kind of thing, right? But once we create a coalition and people have earned the trust and the people have learned the political power or processes, then I think, you know, that specificity isn't necessarily required. So there are some really great local organizations, and I'm sorry, I'm speaking specifically about the Rogue Valley, which is what I'm familiar with. For the people that are coming from other places in Oregon, I'm sure that there are other really great organizations, and if you're coming from a particular place, you know, and you're like, I don't know what my organizations are that are working with Latinos, you know, I'd be happy to take down your name and your email address, and we could find what those are, you know. But in the Rogue Valley, we have some really awesome organizations. We have, you know, Unite Oregon, that is doing a lot of work with Latino populations. UNETE, which is a farm worker advocacy and immigration association. Northwest Seasonal Workers Association that tries to bring in all of the seasonal workers and provide benefits for them. The Northwest Forest Worker Center. And then Migrant Education and La Clínica del Valle. So on the education front and then on the healthcare front, we have a lot of great organizations that are already scheduled out in terms of events. Join them. Join them for an event. Become a face that is familiar. You know, in the Know Your Rights, this would be a great opportunity to come in and for people to sort of make those connections and bridge building. It is going to take a lot of work. I'm not going to lie. Like, building a coalition takes a lot of work, but we have some really great opportunities through local organizations. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can use those organizations. You know, we have a really great opportunity right now, I think, in terms of naturalization. So, as I said before, my husband is an immigration attorney. Prior to the election, he was doing about 3 naturalization applications a month. Currently, he is doing 1 application a day.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. It is off the hook. People are becoming or wanting to become to become a U.S. citizen. It's a lengthy process. It's not like you fill in your paperwork. It's also costly. You know, it isn't like you turn it in and, okay, bam, I'm a U.S. citizen, right? It takes a while. There are all kinds of biometrics. You have to get your fingerprints done, and you know, there's all this kind of vetting, right? However, I've never seen this of 1 application a day. And he is like, we have the opportunity of a movement to actually begin with all of these people that are becoming US citizens.
Okay. Josefina again.
Yeah, we have like a plan with the people that want to be citizen, and it's like make tamales, sell the tamales, and put that money to help the people because the process is expensive.
Yes.
Have the fingerprints and all that stuff is expensive, and there are people that have different issues before be a citizen. They cost money as well, and like make like, tamales, something like that. They raise money to help that people that pushing. Okay, you can be citizen. Why you need it? I know you need money. You need this. You need that. We can help you with the money, raising money. That will be very helpful.
Yes.
Yeah.
I do want to say that if individuals are below the poverty level, there are waivers for those expensive citizenship applications. But the process in and of itself is, so like here, if you wanted to become a US citizen, and you have to, part of that process is getting your fingerprints done, you can't get them done here. We have to travel to Portland. Yes.
Eugene, maybe, too, federal government.
Eugene, occasionally, it's not all the time. No, it's
Police
Portland.
department?
No, they used to do it through the police department, but they don't anymore.
So if we're getting one naturalization application a day, how do we capture, I mean, this is a motivated population that's trying to become citizens. They want to get engaged, they want to vote. How do we capture that information from the different immigration lawyers so that we can target tactics straight at this community of people who are engaged new citizens?
So here's what I was thinking, because it's only been recently that my husband, you know, he's been working like a crazy man recently, lately, and then he started kind of tabulating, and he's like, wow, this is what is happening, right? And I feel like, you know, lawyers are obviously going to keep their clients, the privacy of their clients. They have to, right? And we would want that for ourselves. But I think that this is like a really important time for different organizations to create, like, say, a welcome U.S. citizen packet. Like, here are the organizations that care about your issues as Latinos, you know? And so you might not know who the individuals are, but I was like thinking about, you know, like, can't we do, you know, I was thinking about you, Erika, because I was like, she's super motivated, and if I tell her, let's do something, I know it's going to happen, right? But I was thinking, why can't we create, like through Unite Oregon and the various Racial Equity Coalition, which is an organization I represent, why can't we create a packet and leave it with those different immigration attorneys or those different agencies, because not everybody's an immigration attorney. We have, like, in Portland and in this area, we have accredited representatives also that are able to do status adjustments and things like that. Targeting those people and saying, hey, do you mind, you know, and it's what we heard in the prior presentation, not presenting ourselves as a particular partisan group, right? But really sort of being interested but you know, now you know, like familialism, blah, 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 all of these kinds of things, you know, driver's licenses. Our community is still hoping that this situation gets solved, right? And really making a targeted effort to capture those individuals and bring them along, right? We have, I really think, like, when he was telling me this, I think he told me this like a week ago, I was like, fuck. We have an opportunity, and like we need to like take it, right? Plus, by the way, these individuals are doing their applications. It's going to take them months. You know, sometimes it's up to a year, right? We could be like, wait, so we have time to actually create the packets, right? And do something. You see, I'm like just super motivated about this, right? And you know, and really bring people on board, because you're absolutely right. They are naturalizing for a reason. They're motivated.
This is the good side of Trump.
This is sure, you know, but yes.
It was part of the motivation,
Yeah,
right?
it was part of the motivation, and let's seize it. Let's take it.
I might add, you mentioned that the attorneys have confidentiality limitations, but, and I'm not real familiar with what it takes to become a citizen, public citizen or American citizen, but I suspect that information is public through some agency, identification of new American citizens. So you might be able to get that information through the relevant agency. There maybe there's some privacy concerns there.
Let me find that out. I know that usually at naturalization ceremonies, you usually get registered to vote, and then once that happens, you know, then you know, there's a way of maybe targeting people in that particular manner, right? But I do think we're like, wow, we have this like golden opportunity. In California, it's the same thing. You know, my husband belongs to AILA, which is a national immigration association, and the immigration lawyers do not have capacity for dealing with all of the people who are wanting to become U.S. citizens. But guess what? We have to take into account that for a lot of the people, this is a brand new process that may seem really overwhelming. So how do we onboard people in ways that bring them along, right? So anyway, that's actually, my hope here was that in the last like 5, 10, 15, I'm actually pretty proud of myself because I usually go over time. But, you know, my hope is that actually we could like spend the rest of the minutes here either answering questions or actually thinking about like these packets or targeting or, you know, and the next steps that you all would want to take in organizing. I do want to say that there should always be some Latino participation, right? So that it isn't like, you know, non-Latinos deciding for Latinos or that kind of thing, that there should always be some kind of partnership. And that also will allow people to feel like you are being inclusive. Question, and then question and question? No? Maybe, okay, and then there. So name again. And
Lisa from Bend, and okay, I'll stand up. I am making an assumption, and it could be, and I want to validate whether or not it's true, that it might be valuable to go into these communities with some level of Spanish language skills, where either the candidate has it or they're going and making sure that there's an interpreter available for questions so that people who are potentially able to vote but may not have the language skills to ask the challenging questions that they want to ask have that opportunity to communicate. Would that be of value?
what do you think, Erika? Yeah. The thing is, if it's people like Erika and I that were born in the U.S. or were raised in the United States, obviously we don't necessarily, the translation we need is just about the political process itself. But a lot of folks like my parents, when they naturalized, my parents are still, even to this day, and my dad's like a successful realtor now, but he was like, oh, I don't really speak English. And I'm like, well, how is it that you do your business, right? But there's this kind of feeling in immigrant communities that they don't really know. So having a Spanish speaker would be valuable.
There's also the function, as you brought up, the La Familia and the importance of La Familia. If you're capturing even the non-voting parents and engaging them in the process, you still have that power of La Familia to take it to the kids in the next generation.
Yes. So as an example of that, when I was doing voter registration in my church, I had several families that I don't know what their status is. They told me that they could not vote, so whatever that happened to be. But one mother was like, I have 5 sons. Give me the voter registrations. And I was like, okay, but I need them by next Sunday because the date on them matters. I said, and don't have them dated until that Sunday when you bring the voter registrations back, right? And she was like, I'm gonna have them register. And our voter registration form is actually really easy, right? And so I gave her Spanish and English so that if she wanted to take the lead on it. And then the next Sunday, she showed up with those voter registrations. And her kids are all adults. But because it's La Familia and it's La Mama telling you to be like, hey, you're voting, right? You know, it was, so that's the Latino cultural citizenship that I'm talking about, where engaging the parents is really key. And I can't remember who I said was next, but, okay. And then here, lady with the,
I'm Donna, and I'm from South Wasco County, indivisible. There's a perception in our group, one of our concerns and hopes is to really bring more of the Latino community into doing exactly what you're talking about. And there's a perception that there's a hesitancy because people are wanting to lay low right now.
Yeah.
And so even with the community that have citizenship, that because they don't want to put anybody else at risk, that's the perception. There still may be a hesitancy on the part of naturalized citizens for that reason, because of community and family. So I'm wondering about if you have ideas about how to, I guess, how to recruit and join involved in a way that respects that, and whether that perception is even accurate. I mean,
and so feel free to jump in. This is why it's so key to work with organizations that have already won the trust. So like here, for example, if the Southern Oregon Education Service District, which runs migrant education, and is headed by Charlie Bauer, some of you may know Charlie. If Charlie says something is going to happen and he puts on an event, he has the trust of the community and people show up, right? And then thinking about spaces. If it happens in a Catholic church hall, you know, or it happens in an evangelical, you know, church hall where people feel, because the one thing about ICE that is, well, there are many things about ICE that are interesting, quotes, right? But one thing about ICE is that unless they're targeting someone who is a very dangerous individual, and right now things under the Trump executive order, this is really horrible because ICE agents have discretion to say, oh, you know, she's a danger to the community, let's deport her, right? But they are still respecting what are called sort of safe and sacred spaces. So churches would be those, schools also. So having something in a school or a church versus like say an unknown community space, you know, so if someone said like, hey, you know, the armory is really huge, let's bring in armory, right, you know, but in a school, our people know generally that those believe it or not, ICE actually cares about PR. And some of those individuals have told my husband, yeah, it would actually look really, really bad if we like went into a church or a school to do something. So those would be my suggestions. I don't know if you feel like about the laying low, and
I think something that has been happening is going to the community spaces like in like apartment complexes. You know how they always have like the community building like in trailer parks and things like that. So I know that there were like a few events and they were very successful because people live near them, so like transportation wasn't a barrier. Right. And like leaving their kids like at home, they were like next door or something, so it was like nearby family. So maybe just like reaching out and having like a community member reserve that community space and doing a training or whatever.
And finding that community member that also has cred in that community to help, you know, this is why the partnering up is really key. The other thing that since you brought it up, providing childcare. That's a big one. Because you know what? People are not necessarily going to want to talk like what in the know your rights sessions. we don't want our children to be in Know Your Rights sessions. If they're really young, it's like traumatic for them, right? But having childcare shows another kind of interest in the Latino community and understanding of our community.
I just want to share with you, I'm not a Latinx, you say. I'm an East European Jew, and I got naturalized here in the United States in 1993, I believe. And it was a painful, it was just a difficult journey. But I remember one helpful thing was that the local adult education provided classes in help how to become a citizen. They told us about not just the process, how to get interviewed by the, it's really
taking the
intimidating.
test.
Taking the test is a big thing. So that class was so helpful. I don't think I could have done it without it. So I don't know if you guys or, we communally could provide some kind of education.
Yes,
to
so
make
there
the
are
process easier.
places like UNETE does provide English and citizenship classes. I know that nonprofit legal services here locally were providing classes as well. And then my husband, generally speaking, when he charges, so he's not his own employer, but when he charges people for his services, that includes his coaching through the exams, because there's a written exam, and then there's an interview, and then a written. They want to make sure that you actually can write in the English language, right? And speak it. That's part of the interview process. So hooking up with, so for those of you that have the game plan of talking to local immigration lawyers, hooking up with, like, hey, you want to become a U.S. citizen? Here's where the classes are at, and the post. Hey, as you become a U.S. citizen, here are the things that you can do. Here are some organizations. Great, thank you. Here are some organizations that can help you out. That would be really great. Yeah. So was there one last question? We have 5 minutes. Okay. Thanks.
So what I'm hearing you say, and I'm not sure if I have it right, that part of how we might be able, females might be able to relate to this is having the old white men decide what we can and can't do with our body. So I think that looking at that, I know I feel discriminated against, and that my premiums could be higher than a man. So I think if we look at it through those eyes, and not being from the Latino community, I think that that's a comparison, that we may feel like we don't get a say in this. And I think that we could look at the Latino community, that they're feeling that and the fear. I mean, I had fear too about being a woman and what they're trying to do to us. But I think if we look at who's making the decisions and we look at it through that lens, we can understand what they may be going through.
Yeah, it is always key in organizing, I think, having the people that you want to be partners to really be partners. This is why I think like on May 15th, if you're a local, I'm doing like a sanctuary cities or sanctuary neighbors presentation with the folks that are part of UNETE and my husband as well. And we hated the way that initially some of the sanctuary conversations were a top-down, like, oh, those poor people, let's see what we can do for them. And I was like, hey, like, let's equalize. Exactly. So always having that perspective, right, of these are adults that we're talking about, right? And bringing them in and giving them the dignity and respect as adults. Because in my experience, I've only been on this planet for 48 years, almost 49, right? But in my experience, it feels to me like the individuals that you want to help out in organizing oftentimes know exactly what they want and they need, right? They just need maybe like the opportunity or vehicle for that. So, last question? Yes.
Well, it's just a suggestion, and one of the way we can build in the relation with the Latinos or the immigrants thing will be have rapid response organizations or whatever you want to call.
Yes.
Because today we need to check what happened to our community.
Yeah.
And we started doing rapid response groups over there in Central Oregon and with the Invisible group as well. And that is something that we need to start doing it because we don't know when ICE is coming or the police is coming or how they going to affect our community. Not only the Latinos, almost in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So some communities, like Hannah is part of our community response team here in the Valley. I'm part of it as well. And having like, what are the protocols? You know, very interestingly enough, we had a situation here in the Valley with ICE where someone was actually, a couple of ICE agents were looking for an individual. They targeted that individual's family. That family didn't have any idea where that person was. They hadn't been in contact with that person for a few years. ICE was making a 10-year-old translate about how they might take her away from her parents, right? If and that's actually a complaint that's actually being pushed forward right now against, against ICE, I think, through Unite Oregon, I believe. But here's what's really interesting. This person, one of these individuals had gone to a Know Your Rights presentation. And she remembered that that the sheriff had made a statement about protecting communities. So they called the sheriff's department. The sheriff came and, believe it or not, intervened with ICE and was like, hey, what are you guys doing here? They'd been sort of at this space for hours, stalking the people, right? And then ICE left, right? Here's where like your local law enforcement can really, you create these partnerships with people in the community that have some agency to actually get, your local people on board. Right? Anyway, it is lunchtime, so thank you so much for your time.